The most useful catch figures for salmon are actually those of nets rather than rods. This is because nets are less affected by fishing conditions, and also it's possible to get effort figures for nets. That is to say, the amount of catching effort that went into producing the catches. With rods, this is very seldom available, and of course the more effort you put in, the more fish you will catch, just as the more fish in the river, the more fish you will catch, and the less fish in the river, the less you will catch. So this graph shows the average annual salmon catches of nets in the Tweed estuary for 160 years from 1840 onwards, and the blue line shows the average number of nets from which data can be had for each of those years. The catch figures are the black and grey columns. Now the grey part is that caught from February to June, and the black part of the column that caught from July to September. The first point to notice is that the period of spring salmon, when most of the catches were being made from February to June, was not actually a period of high catches for these nets, and of course the estuary nets were in the prime position for the whole river. They got first shot at anything that was going up the river. The really big catches are in the second part of the season, from July to September, and there's two periods of those really big catches: the 1840s and again the 1960s to the 1980s, and these are grouse catches rather than salmon. Grouse tend to survive better at sea because of course they have 1 year less to get through before returning. Now, perhaps surprisingly, from the 1850s to the 1950s, the average annual catches of these nets in the estuary, the prime position in the river, varied from about 500 to 1500, which is not actually a huge number. In fact, in the last few years of all-season netting, 95 to 2000, the nets were averaging in the estuary about 1,000 a year, somewhat better in fact than that century from the 1850s to the 1950s. So when the nets went out of business, it wasn't really from lack of fish. What it was actually lack of price. In the 1850s to 1950s, salmon was a luxury fish, and net and cobble fishing, which takes a crew of 5 to do and can fish for at most usually about 8 hours in the 24, could still make a profit. In the 1990s, of course, by then the salmon, farm salmon, was the cheapest fish in the shops, and of course there was the drift net fishing to compete with for the wild fish market. Until now, actually, in some places the drift nets could be set and then left, and the 1 or 2 people setting them could go off and do other things. So the economic competition with net and cobble was of course severe. There has been therefore a great decline in the number of Tweed nets. You can see in this graph. Now the estuary nets are the orange, and the lower river nets from Whitadder to Till the green. And the big decline is in 1981, when the old Berwick Salmon Fishing Company went bankrupt. Some of the nets were bought out from it and carried on. Then there was a drop in the in-river nets, the Whitadder to Till nets, in 1987 with a buyout organised by the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Trust. Just recently, the very last of the commercial nets in the lower river and estuary have closed. So it's the end of a 1,000-year history really for the nets of the estuary and the lower river. We still have, however, a significant net fishery that takes Tweed fish, and this is in the Northumberland waters, particularly the North Northumberland drift nets, which go from the Tyne up to the Tweed border. And of course the interesting thing there is, is there any sort of relationship between the catches made by those nets and the catches on the lower river a little bit later? So in other words, can the number of fish being caught in the nets affect the number of fish caught by the rods? And this is a tale of two periods. If we look at this period before 2003, when there were something like 70 drift nets, you can see that there's no connection at all. However many thousands of fish nets caught, it didn't really have any effect on any apparent effect on the numbers of fish being caught in the lower river. But since 2003, when there was a major buyout leaving 14 licenses left, there has been a very strong relationship between the catches reported by the drift nets and the catches made by the rods on the lower river. So effectively, the more fish the nets catch, the more fish the rods in the lower Tweed catch. Two possible reasons for this. Either they're exploiting the same fish stock, which is to say Tweed fish, or all the stocks of all the rivers in the borders of Northumberland must vary in strength together. Rod fisheries have increased as net fisheries have decreased, but mainly in the tributaries, as we can see by comparing the number of registered fisheries there were in 1911 and with the present day. The changes actually have been rather slight, except on the upper Tweed and the Whitadder. Big increase in the upper Tweed, mainly by fisheries extending further upriver, but also existing ones splitting. And the Whitadder, of course, was really only properly opened up to salmon migration in the 1990s and has led to the establishment of a significant fishery on that tributary. This might be a surprise to see this lack of change in main river netting rod fisheries, but actually in the past most of the lower Tweed net fishings had rod fishings as well, and over time rod fisheries have amalgamated as well as split. Rod catches have certainly increased over time. We do have some very early totals from the beginning of the 20th century, but they were largely educated estimates by the clerks. Compulsory and centralised recording started in 1952, and so we have a series of figures from that time. And here are the rod catches. Now they're divided up into three periods, basically early spring, summer and autumn. We can put some information on to this graph. 1974 the Tweed hatchery closed. That had no effect, which is not a surprise really. Then we had the in-river net buyout 1987, the estuary net buyout 2000, the drift net buyout 2003. As you can see at both those net buyouts there was a sort of step increase in the catches being made by the rods, and that I think has to be associated with the fewer catches being made by the nets. Now we can put these figures onto a trend line, as you can see in this graph. Now it starts in 1970 because by then the transition from the previous spring salmon dominated phase to our present autumn fish dominated phase had been completed, and it's pretty much a straightforward upward trend over the years. A period of stagnation in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, but we've got two recent outliers. We've got the superabundant fish of 2010 and the rather scarce fish of 2014. What's interesting about that, of course, is that those abundant fish of 2010 were the parent generation of the rather scarce growth of 2014. Now that's just another example of how the numbers of fish in an adult generation don't really have much connection with the numbers of adults produced in the next generation. Now the obvious question is, what is the catch rate by rods? Now the standard technique for this is to catch fish at the bottom of the river. If you've got a fish trap, that's very convenient. We don't, so we net instead, and then we see how many of these tagged fish are later caught upriver by anglers. Now of course the catch rate of the untagged fish should be the same as the rate for the tagged fish. And the results for that are that although we've only got a rather small sample of spring salmon, they had a pretty high catch rate, almost 30%. For summer and autumn it's been much lower. For autumn just over 4%, slightly higher for summer, but we have had problems in getting a figure for summer fish. If the river is too high, we can't work the nets and get the fish for tagging. If the river is too low, we can catch the fish for tagging, but then they stick at the bottom of the river and don't move upstream. Overall, it's about 5%. We can make comparisons with similar data from other rivers. There's a good set from the Welsh Dee. There's a fish trap at Chester, which gives them the fish that they can use for tagging. Same sort of thing, very high catch rate early on, and at the end of the season, a much lower one. Now this is partly due to the fact that in September and October, at the end of the fishing season, fish are going to be subjected to less angling pressure. The end of the season, of course, ends the angling pressure. But in behavioural terms, spring salmon are much more likely to be caught than late autumn salmon. Autumn salmon have their minds set on spawning. Spring salmon have just come out of the sea where they've been feeding. We have some very old data from the 1890s on the stomach contents of net-caught Tweed salmon, and up till June stomach contents are relatively common. After June almost nothing is ever found. So spring salmon seem to have been feeding more recently than later salmon, which makes them, it would appear, more likely to be caught. Now that catch rate of less than 10% in the autumn means that more than 9 out of 10 salmon that run the Tweed then never touched by an angler. In fact, if anglers could catch 2 out of 10 salmon in autumn instead of just 1 out of 10, they would double the autumn catch figures. Now what's also become clear from this tagging is that the longer the fish are in the river, the less likely they are to be caught. And we can see how the catchability of fish declines. Half of our recaptures are made within 1 month of tagging, and almost 90% within 2 months. After that, the fish are pretty reluctant to be caught. Now that's an important management point, because it tells us that unless we have a constant stream of fresh fish coming into the river for all the months of the fishing season, we are not going to have good fishing. If all the fish came in at one time, they would simply go stale in the river and become uncatchable, even though there might be lots of them. And that appears to have been what happened in 2011. There's a very large early run of fish, late August and September, and they simply became stale in the river and largely uncatchable. So that's the story of Tweed rod and net catches, and as I say, the take home message from that is that our management needs to concentrate on having lots of different stocks in good health to keep that constant supply of new fish coming into the river for as much of the season as possible.